Hey, welcome to this episode of I Wonder, where we are wondering what is the secret to parenting kids in the digital age? How do we find room for nuance? Welcome. So, has it been a bit of a time here in America? We've had a lot of things happening. We've had a new president-elect. We've had a lot of feelings in a lot of different places. And I would imagine that this topic, even though it was originally how do you parent children in a digital age, is really kind of applicable maybe to all of us at this point. And so I'm not going to talk a long time because I feel like there's so much out there about this topic, and there's a lot of how-tos, and there's a lot of books that tell you about anxiety, and there's a lot of books that tell you all the detrimental things that are happening to our children in the world today. And there's a lot of things to scare you. And really what it comes down to is part of a little story I'll tell you. When my kids and I were driving home, I moved my two college ones in. They actually share an apartment, and I moved them into their apartment over the summer. And we were driving back home from the college town. And I don't know even what the topic was that got us started, but I was sort of ranting and raving about how their generation sometimes seemed to too quickly jump to conclusions based on things they heard on the internet, be it TikTok or Instagram or Snapchat or whatever. They heard from a friend, or they heard from a guy, or their favorite YouTuber said this or whatever. It's always been a little bit of a caution for me as a parent. I never want to belittle the places where they get their information, and because I just love that they're curious about things. But also I want to make sure that I want to make sure I'm respecting their world, but also sort of imparting the knowledge that I might have just from experience as well. I will be honest, in the car ride home, I don't think I was doing any of that well. I think I was pretty frustrated and simply just, ranting about there being all these extreme views and no room for nuance. And my oldest stopped me in the middle of it. We had earlier in the conversation been talking about a book that I'm working on, and she stopped me in the middle of my rant and goes, "There's the book title. Your book title is Room for Nuance, Parenting Kids in a Digital Age." And so there you have it. She can take credit for this podcast title, but that was such an eye-opener to me, because I had said there needs to be room for nuance, but I hadn't really contemplated that that's actually what I believe, that there is no room these days for nuance amongst the adults specifically. It seems to be either one extreme or the other, and if one is true, then the other one can't be, and if the other one's true, then this one can't be. And like, we have to pick a side, and there's no sort of gray area and all of the things. I don't want to start ranting again. So I'll just tell you that was the gist of the conversation, was that everything is very polarized and extreme and black and white and simple and, this or that. And it all sort of came to a head for me when we all were fighting in our house over the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it came to a head because there is nothing simple about that. Nothing. There's nothing simple about it. Meaning there are hundreds of years of information and hundreds of years of things that lead to nothing but gray area and nuance. And probably, I think I can confidently say, everybody agrees that we want peace, but the extremes come from what we think that means or what we think that looks like. And you were sort of, it just was an ugly thing that we were trying to simplify into a yes or no, you're right or you're wrong situation. And that is when I started really worrying about, what are we doing to our kids? If we are, if my children, who I think I have raised to be these curious, inquisitive, don't settle for the first fact people, are coming to me with these really extreme views, one way or the other, it didn't even matter which side, it was extreme views on this topic that I know from years of living on this earth is just not simple and not easy to see a solution and not plain. If they were sort of falling for the notion that it was, and I think I have taught them not to be that way, well, then what must it be like for people with even younger kids in this world right now? There is so much information and so many outlets for that information and so many ways to manipulate information. And I'm not sure our kids are learning how to approach it critically, and that there's even such a thing as nuance and gray area and middle ground of some of these things. I'm not even talking about Israel-Palestine right now, but just in general, I think the information that they are receiving from whatever channel they happen to be on, whether it's YouTube or TikTok or Instagram. I don't think many kids are on Instagram these days, but, or a Reddit thread or a Substack if they're into that, or if they are on Discord for whatever reason, their brains and their personalities are open now to just a wider variety of inputs. And it's nearly impossible to know all of the inputs, much less know which inputs you can trust. And maybe we should never have been blindly trusting some of these inputs to begin with. I'm not claiming that we were doing it right back in the day, but I am claiming that it's a harder thing to do now. And so I want to talk about a couple things that I would recommend and that I tried to do for my kids, and I try to still do now that they're older and we can, and quite frankly, that I do for myself too. And it starts with just the understanding that we need to critically take in information. When I was an 8th grade English teacher, one of the things I taught, actually, even when I taught 4th grade, one of the things I taught as part of a curriculum in 4th grade that was like a social studies curriculum, I taught critical literacy. And then certainly by 8th grade, because the internet had happened and they could Google things and they could, it was the olden days, but what they could do is Google and find, quote, websites that looked legitimate, that would have things on them that they, maybe they were going to use as facts. And so I had to teach them, like, that's not research. Some guy named Larry in his basement who put up a website on, I don't know, string theory and has zero sources and doesn't talk about how he knows any of this stuff. It's just him telling you his opinion on it. You can't use that as a source for your research paper. And so that's where it started way back in the day, in the early 2000s. It was me as the teacher teaching them to question the information that was being presented to them. And by question it, I mean, don't question the information itself, but question where the source is getting this information. Are they just creating this information? Is this their opinion based on some things they've heard? Or is this actually based in historical documentation or something like that? It used to be way back in the day, we didn't necessarily consider first-person documentation to be as relevant. Somebody's journal wasn't necessarily looked on as highly as, as an official government document or something. I think those days are over. I think we are taking people's personal experiences, giving them much more weight, which isn't a bad thing. But I do think that also shouldn't be the only source that you have, or you should at the very least question who the person is. Again, we're open to so much more now. We have videos from people supposedly on the ground in some of these places. And, that would be easy to believe. This person's there. They know what's going on. So this must be how it is. When in fact, we've learned over the years, that's not necessarily how it goes. So, for instance, this latest storm we've had, the hurricane in North Carolina, there were many reports coming out of there of governments not responding and people not getting help and all of these things. And yet I had friends on the ground who were saying, that's absolutely not true. The governor of the state came forward and said, that's absolutely not true. Please stop spreading these things. And yet, once a person hears, well, I saw a lady on, videotape that she wasn't getting any help, it's hard to undo that. It's hard to tell someone, well, yes, you saw this thing, but I saw these 3 things. And so these 3 things might be right and yours might be wrong. I remember way back in the day learning about kids and being taught as a teacher, I was a student, of an education student, and being taught how it's much more difficult to undo learning than it is to impart learning. And a lot of kids enter school, especially in science, with learning that needs to be undone. Because they're curious. Kids are curious. And so they ask questions, and oftentimes parents think they have to answer them, whether they know the answer or not. And so they give them a fact that they might, it's all benevolent. But these kids would enter school thinking they understood things like the moon and tides and oceans and, I don't know, stars and whatever else they might have asked about, plant life. And they either had part of the story or the wrong story, or they were told something by their parent that was just a sweet little thing and they took it as scientific fact. And then their teachers had to undo that work and try to actually teach them what really was going on. And so we are wired we're wired to believe first person narrative, and we're wired to believe the first thing that makes sense to us. And so if we're not teaching our kids to critically look at things, they might just believe the first thing that's presented to them. And sometimes that's okay, but sometimes that's exactly the opposite of what you want. So my first thing would be speaking about, if school's not going to do it, you need to do it, but teaching about critical literacy, having a critical eye on information. And I don't just mean having a critical eye on information that doesn't agree with what you think. I mean, having a critical eye for everything. And the way that I do that, the way that I have always practiced it and the way that I have taught it. And I'll be honest, I say I've always practiced it, but it wasn't intentional in the early days. It's just how I'm wired. I'm sort of wired to question everything, but also I learned early on, if my gut says this doesn't make sense, then I should investigate further. And so that would be my advice to you, is tune in and teach your kids to tune in to that little voice that says, I don't know if that makes sense. And then stay curious and start investigating to see why it feels that way. And if it does make sense, it might turn out it does. It might turn out it doesn't. It felt that way to you because it actually doesn't make any sense. We've been in this sort of vortex of wild misinformation for the last, at this point, 8 years. And I'll be honest with you, I am on the side of what many people call lamestream media, but I also don't fully trust media anyway. Probably, no, I won't say I never have. There was definitely a time where if I thought I read it in the newspaper, then I would think that that's what was happening. I don't even trust that anymore. But so I tell you all this to tell you that I don't trust extreme on either side of it. I don't trust, the people who are telling me that there's, aliens coming down. And I also don't trust the people who tell me, I can't think of a blue one, but, that there was like election fraud when Trump won. I don't trust the election fraud people on either side. Let's put it that way. That's how I'm going to say I don't trust the sort of extremism on either side. I always have that. I don't trust the extremism on either side. I always have that little feeling of that doesn't make sense. I always pay attention to that. That's what helps me stay in the nuanced area of it. I'm also a natural studier of human behavior and obviously the human psyche. And so I kind of tend to dig a little deeper into motivation and understanding with things anyway. But that little paying attention to that little curious nagging of this doesn't make any sense has always served me well. And there have been times in the last, year with this wild election in the US where both political sides, I've had a moment of like, that doesn't make sense. Let me dig into that a little further. Here's a headline that somebody that is, that mostly agrees with me shares a headline. And I go, that seems weird. And so let me look into it further. And sure enough, almost every time I have found, well, that's part of the story, but not the full story. And same thing on the other side. More often than not on the other side, I'll be honest, but only because it seems that the people that I know share headlines and don't actually click to articles. And so it doesn't take much sometimes to find the nuance. It doesn't take much to follow that nagging feeling of this doesn't make sense. It doesn't take much to just click around a little bit more and find some more information. Way back in the day when I was teaching my 8th graders, they had to look at the source of things. And not just what was the name of the source, but where is the source getting their information? Way back when I was teaching them that, I really hope they're still using those skills today because it's more important than ever. And that's what we can be teaching our kids, is that you can't just trust the first thing you hear, and you shouldn't ever just trust the first thing you hear. What you should trust is your own gut feeling that alerts you to something not quite sitting right. It might turn out that your gut feeling is just responding to the fact that it's uncomfortable information, but isn't it worth pushing forward to find that out? Isn't it worth understanding why you are having these feelings that, this doesn't feel quite right to me? And in the best case scenario, isn't it worth finding out, this doesn't sit right because it's patently untrue? here's the real facts, here's the real truth, or here's the whole story. More often than not, there is no room for nuance because we're only given bits and pieces that fit the agenda of either extreme. And when you step back and widen out, you notice that actually the whole story contains a lot more to it than just an either or proposition. So for ourselves and for our kids, we are all served better if we stay curious, if we allow room for nuance and gray, and if we tune in to that nagging feeling and allow for the curiosity to follow that nagging feeling so we all become critical in our literacy, and critical in our news gathering, and critical in our information and opinion forming. All right, that's all I got for you today. I hope that answers some of the I wonder questions about how do we make sense of all of the stuff swirling around us at any given time, and how do we help our kids do the same. Thanks for listening.